before, I'm sure, how to buy yarn. There is a lot of yarn out there, and it is a lot of fun to shop for. If you know any knitters or you have delved into knitting social media a bit, you might find people talking about their stash. We like to, have yarn set aside for a rainy day. We buy some yarn. We're not 100% sure what we're going to be using it for, but we have it, we love it, we know it's there when we're ready to use it. But if you are new to knitting and buying yarn, you may find it a bit overwhelming. There are a lot of places to buy it. There are a lot of different kinds of yarn. And you want to make sure you're getting the yarn that you need for your project, but also the yarn that you are going to be happy with. So I'm going to take a few minutes to sort of take a deep dive into yarn. We are going to talk about how yarn is sold. We're going to talk about briefly what kinds of yarn may work for different kinds of projects. And we're also going to talk about some things you should consider when buying yarn to make sure that you get yarn that you are comfortable and happy with. So let's start with how yarn is sold. Yarn is typically categorized by weight, and that's basically just how thick or thin the strand of yarn is. So throughout Knitting 101 and Knitting 102, we have been working with worsted weight yarn. This is sort of a basic, good for a lot of different projects, not too big, not too small weight yarn. So that's why we've started with that. But yarn actually comes in about 6 different weights. And that is how you're going to usually find it sold. If you are going to perhaps your local yarn shop, they may actually have it divided by weight, I hope. That's going to make it easier to shop. And certainly if you go to a big box store, they will definitely have the yarn perhaps separated by brand sometimes, but within that brand, it should be separated by weight as well. So yarn weights. The thinnest yarn is Laceweight. And this is usually used for knitting lace. The very thinnest laced weight is cobweb yarn. But it all kind of falls into this lace category, and this is usually used for very fine gauge knitting. You will use very small needles. Typically, you would use this for things like shawls. Occasionally, you will find a garment like a sweater knit with a lace weight yarn, but it will be knit with a larger size needle so that the lace is very open and airy. Mostly though, you're going to find it used for shawls that are very intricate. This is less popular yarn to be used by itself. However, as knitting trends go, there has been a trend recently pairing sort of fuzzy lace weight yarns with other weight yarns and holding them together to make different kinds of fabric. But in terms of just using the lace yarn by itself, you are mostly going to see that for shawls, and even that is not so common anymore. Next up is fingering weight, which may or may not also be referred to as sock weight for socks. So most sock patterns will use a fingering weight yarn. It can be definitely used for other things. You will find these days, I think most shawl patterns are also knit with a fingering weight yarn. So as you might imagine, not as thin as lace weight, but still a lighter yarn, because you don't want, generally speaking, very thick, heavy socks that don't fit inside your shoes. So while it is also often called sock weight yarn, and it is the yarn that is usually used for socks, it can be also used for many other things. Pretty much anything you can think of. Perhaps less for garments, because again, it is a thinner yarn. Usually, if it is used for a garment, you're going to find, again, knit on bigger needles to make a lighter, airier, drapey fabric. You won't be making as dense a fabric for a fingering weight garment as you would be making for fingering weight socks. After that, we have sport weight, just a bit thicker than fingering weight yarn, and to be honest, not used very often. Definitely you will see it, but in terms of the popularity of yarn, the different yarn weights, that's probably gonna fall, maybe a step above lace weight. You just don't see it as much, either in patterns or in stores or yarn sellers. After sport weight comes DK weight. This is called double knitting weight, and this is a very versatile weight yarn that can be used for just about anything you can think of, and you will see it used for pretty much everything. Again, socks tend to be with a thinner yarn because we want them to fit in our shoes, but house socks, sure. Slippers, DK weight, why not? Definitely hats, mittens, sweaters, shawls, perhaps. Shawls tend to be on the lighter side, fingering weight yarn or lace weight yarn, but you will see DK weight as well. And after that comes worsted weight, the one that we have been using. That's the next step, heavier, thicker, and again, can be used for just about anything. Less so socks and shawls, but you will still see it. In fact, I have a lovely shawl sitting right here that is knit in a worsted weight yarn. So this is a very thick, heavy shawl. This is not a lacy thing that you're going to toss on in the spring. This is basically a wearable blanket, which was my intention with it, to make something big and hefty that you could wrap up in, and that's why it's using that heavier yarn. In fact, it is actually using the heavier yarn held together with the lace weight yarn, as I was talking about just a few minutes ago, to make this fabric that you can probably see is very fuzzy. So worsted weight, perhaps less often with shawls, but you will still see it definitely for sweaters. Worsted weight sweaters can be very warm, so that is definitely a sort of a winter sweater kind of yarn. Hats, great. Mittens, great. Again, another very versatile yarn. All right, so far we've said lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted. Sort of 5.5 here is Aran weight. Aran weight is just a hint heavier, thicker than the worsted weight yarn. They can often be used interchangeably. When you're using them, you may not notice much of a difference. For reasons that are unknown to me, they are categorized separately, but as I said, they can almost be used interchangeably in most projects. It's just a hair thicker than a worsted weight yarn. All right, so that's 5.5, and then 6, bulky. This is a big hefty yarn. You use big hefty needles. It makes a very thick, warm fabric. You are not going to see this for light, airy, drapey garments. This is going to be used for big, hefty kind of ski sweaters, very big, cozy hats. Less so with mittens, just because when you have a fabric that thick, it makes it very hard to move your hands. Maybe slippers, definitely not socks, and rarely shawls, although again, you can basically use anything for a shawl, just up to your imagination. So after bulky, You get into some that are chunky, super chunky. Those are kind of less well defined. They're just going to be big, thick yarns, sometimes using really giant, almost comically large, thick needles. Those are more often than not used kind of to produce a novelty kind of fabric that is supposed to look kind of big and bulky and kind of comical, not your sort of elegant sweaters and things like that. So we got 6 basic yarn categories, and this is how yarn is sold. And now I'm going to kind of go into each one a little bit and tell you what you may or may not be looking for. All right, so before I get a little more specific, for each kind of weight, overall, I want to encourage you as much as you're able to use natural fibers when you are buying yarn. You know, pay attention to allergies, pay attention to how it feels on your skin. But in general, the more natural, the better. I will talk about one exception with sock yarn, but natural fibers tend to breathe and wear better. They're better for the environment. So when possible, natural fibers. So let's start with Laceweight. This is a Laceweight yarn. This particular yarn is made with silk and Surrey alpaca. Surrey alpacas are the fluffy alpacas, and you can see that this yarn is very fluffy. You can see I just got some of the fluff right off the end. So the fluff kind of disguises how really thin this yarn is in the middle. Again, Laceweight yarn, when it is used, most often it is for shawls, or as I was saying now, holding it together with a heavier yarn to make a kind of fluffy fabric like this. You can see that this is very delicate. I mean, even with the silk in here, which can be strong, but when you get to those fuzzy bits, they'll just pull right off. So Laceweight yarn can be very delicate. And it's not something I'm going to recommend for a beginner because it can be very frustrating to work with. It gets tangled more easily. It can be hard to work on the needles because it is harder to see, it's thinner. So I would not recommend Laceweight yarn for a beginner project unless you are planning to do what I was mentioning and hold it together with another yarn. If and when you buy a Laceweight yarn, it's very helpful for it to be combined with something like silk. It makes it very drapey. It also makes it stronger because the yarn is made to be so thin that silk can give it a little bit of extra strength. Fingering weight yarn. This is the sock weight yarn. This sometimes just called sock yarn. This is a really fun yarn to shop for because it comes in just so many different colors. This kind of sock weight yarn is called self-striping. When you knit with this, it will create stripes while you knit. This kind is called variegated. Just by looking at it, you can't really tell what you're gonna get. You can see you're gonna get lots of different interesting colors, but you're not sure how they're going to knit up. This is something that has become, that's really getting blown out, something become kind of newly popular over the last few years, and this is a speckled yarn. So you can see it has an overall color, and then in spots it just looks like somebody dripped bits of dye on it to create little drops of color. Okay, you might also have something like this, which is still variegated, but much more subtle. So as I said, to the best of your ability, I recommend that you give natural fibers your priority. But when it comes to sock yarn, socks are very hard wearing. and getting something with some nylon in it. Maybe it's usually 20 to 25% in the fingering weight yarns. That can help your socks when you're ready to knit those last longer. So if you are planning to use your fingering weight yarn for socks, I would recommend looking for sock yarn that has a little bit of a nylon in it. That's going to make it a little bit more durable. There are two popular styles. This one is what is called plied. If you look up close, you can see that the strand of yarn is created by twisting together two or more strands of fiber. This makes a sturdier, more durable yarn. If you are buying fingering weight yarn for socks, you really want to get a plied yarn. And it will usually say on the label. So this one, which is from a lovely indie dyer, see if we can get it to, there we go, says 2-ply. So you can see that this is a plied yarn, and that is what you want for socks. What you don't want to use for socks is a single ply or unplied yarn. That's this. This is a yarn from the same indie dyer. But when you look at this strand, there is no twist. This is yarn, or excuse me, fiber that is spun into a long strand to create yarn, but it is then not twisted together with the second strand. There's no plying done here, so it doesn't have that twisting from the plying to make it more durable. It also doesn't have any nylon. So this is not something that you want to use for socks. They will wear right out. You need the plied yarn, and you need perhaps some nylon in there. This is wonderful for a shawl or perhaps a very lightweight sweater, but not for socks. Do not use this for socks. So a DK weight yarn is going to come in all kinds of colors. It's going to come in all kinds of fibers. And unless you are planning to use it specifically for socks, which again, not the most common yarn for socks, you really don't have to worry about that fiber content as far as durability. This is going to be perfectly fine for hats, sweaters, mittens, and things like that. And so you will find, as you get into the DK weight and the worsted weight yarns, you'll start finding you will start finding more of a variety of fibers often being used in the yarns. You'll start seeing the cashmere. You will sometimes be seeing silk. These are both DK weight yarns. You can see this one is this is indie dyed, a speckled yarn. This is naturally dyed, so natural plant dyes, and this is dyed on 100% alpaca. You can see how this is less drapey, less floppy. So really DK weight and worsted weight are going to start coming in all kinds of varieties. This is a worsted weight that is hand dyed and a variegated, so you're still going to get those kind of variegated colors. This is probably not necessarily something you want for a sweater. It maybe is too busy, so you might be using this for different kinds of accessories. This, you know, is a nice, what we would call tonal. Like, you look at it and you say, okay, it's purple, but it's not, you know, the exact same purple in every spot. So you get, it's not 100% uniform. You don't get that sort of machine produced look, but it is still purple. It is a single color. And this is, again, a worsted weight. This one is 100% merino. So this is kind of your basic go-to worsted weight yarn. So variety of colors and variety of fibers are common through all of the different kinds of yarn, how do you know what you're looking for? So we already talked about when you're looking for sock yarn, maybe get something with a little nylon, definitely get something that is plied. Beyond that, what kind of guidance can I give you? First, my first bit of guidance is to put the yarn against your skin and see how it feels. So this is 100% superwash merino wool. This is a very soft wool that most people are not going to find itchy right next to their skin. If you want to test it, you're going to put it on sort of the inside of your arm. You're going to put it next to your neck. And that's where you want to check and see how itchy it feels. If you're going to be using it for a sweater, if you're going to be using it for a hat, it's, you know, especially depending on how much hair you have, that may not be so important. Mittens, you know, your hands don't really get itchy, so that's less of a concern. But you want to make sure that you're comfortable with it. So put yarn next to your skin and see what feels okay. Merino is going to be the softest, and it's probably also going to be the most common. In terms of plies, most yarn is plied, and plied yarn is, again, plied is the one that is at least 2 strands of fiber twisted together. Most yarn is plied. Plied yarn is more durable. If you're a new knitter and just buying yarn, I'm going to recommend that you get a plied yarn because it is going to sort of behave better. It is going to be more durable. There are 2 different kinds of merino wool that you will encounter, and that's just merino wool and superwash merino wool. Superwash merino wool is intended to be machine washable. In order to do this, the fiber goes through a process, usually a chemical process that makes it less sticky, so that you can put it in the washing machine and it will not felt or shrink or any of those things you may have seen your store-bought wool sweaters do if you accidentally toss them in the washer. The other thing that this process does is in changing kind of the structure of the wool, it also makes dye stick to the wool better. So superwash wools that are dyed tend to be brighter as well. The color tends to be richer. There's nothing particularly wrong with superwash wool. If you have environmental concerns, it is a more processed wool. The only thing I will say is that the process to make it less sticky so that it doesn't shrink and felt also makes it kind of stretch out over time. So whatever you knit may not hold its shape as well over time. And I still would not put it in the washing machine. And we can get into that in another lesson down the road. But regardless of what you're making and what kind of yarn you're using, you should really be washing by hand and laying flat to dry. So as a new knitter, with all of this information about these weights and colors and plied and unplied and different fibers, how do you know what to look for? First, if you are using a pattern, the pattern will tell you. The pattern should either tell you the name of the exact yarn used. That may or may not be helpful because that may be a yarn that is not really in your price range, but you can use the information there to help you pick a substitute, because it should tell you the name of the yarn, which you can then go look up and say, oh, this is a DK weight yarn, or this is a worsted weight yarn, and then you know that's what you have to look for. The pattern should also tell you how much you need, more or less. Now, that may be, the pattern tells you that you need 6 balls of such and such yarn, and so you're gonna have to do the math find out from the yarn how many yards or meters it has, multiply it by 6, and then that's how many yards or meters you need of that weight yarn. You also want to, if you're not using the yarn that is listed in your pattern, you also want to probably pick a yarn that has the same general qualities. So if the pattern uses a superwash wool, you probably want to use a superwash wool. And I'm going to include a link right here to a tutorial I did on making good yarn substitutions that maybe you're not quite ready for yet, but you can bookmark it for later when you're ready to get into that. So your first step is going to be to look at your pattern, see what it tells you to buy. If you can buy that yarn, great. If you can't quite swing the particular yarn it calls for, you want to look for a yarn that is the same weight and more or less the same fiber. If you're kind of just going from scratch, you don't have a pattern, you just want to, I don't know, do some swatching, practicing, then the sky is kind of the limit. Just know that beginning at lace is the very thinnest, and then up to bulky is the very heaviest, and it steps up from there. So if you want to try to just kind of make a hat, that's probably going to be a DK or a worsted weight yarn. If you're ready to try your first pair of socks, fingering weight is probably the way to go there. For sweaters, your first sweater, probably a DK or a worsted weight yarn. You know, a shawl, as I said earlier, lace can be tricky for beginners, but if you want to try a shawl, maybe look for a fingering weight yarn. How much do you need though, right? For a shawl, most patterns are going to call for somewhere between 400 and 600 yards. For socks, for women who have around a size 7, 8 foot, that's going to probably come in around 300 yards. Obviously more for larger feet and men who have larger feet. But most sock yarn, the fingering weight yarn that is, you know, designed for socks, that's usually going to already have about 400 yards, and that's going to be fine for a pair of socks for most people. Larger men who have larger feet, or women who have larger feet, maybe you need 2. Garments are trickier. It really depends on your size, and there are all kinds of sizes. And then it also depends on how thick or thin your yarn is. So again, that's something where, especially if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend having a pattern and not trying to wing it, and using the information provided there. A hat, if you just want to try a DK or worsted weight hat, that's probably going to come in 200 yards or less. Mittens or fingerless mittens, the same in a DK or a worsted weight. So there's one more topic. I know, I can't believe it. There's so much. And that's just about how the yarn is sold, like what it looks like when it's sold. So you hear a lot of different names used. Basically, yarn is either going to be sold in some form, and some people are going to call it a ball or a cake, or this one even has another name that I can't remember, that is ready to use, or is going to be sold like this, and you have to wind it yourself. Most of the yarn that you're going to get from your big box store, from a place like Knit Picks, some of the kind of larger yarn companies that are more of a mass produced yarn, a larger business, they're going to come in some format that you can already use. You don't have to do anything with it, whether it's a ball or a cake or a pill, I think maybe this is called. All you have to do is take the label off and you can start using it. Yarn from indie dyers and from smaller companies is usually going to come like this, and you have to wind this yarn. Now there are tools that you can get but they're a little pricey, especially if you're a beginner. There is a way to do this by hand, to wind it into a usable ball. A lot of times you can also ask the store to do it for you. They might charge you, but that's going to be a smaller charge than buying the equipment, and it's going to take less time than winding the ball by hand. So, like I said, people are going to use a lot of different names for these, and none of them really matter too much, except that you should know whether, and you're going to see a picture or you're going to see the actual thing, you should know whether you're going to have to do something with it to get it ready to use like this, or if it's going to be ready to go. Where are you buying your yarn? Your easiest stop is going to be your Michaels, your Joann's, your whatever your local craft store is. Your area may also have what is called a local yarn shop, a local yarn shop, which is just going to be an independent business that sells yarn and yarn related things. You can also buy yarn online for sort of basic kind of workhorse, reasonably priced yarns. Knit Picks is a good choice. Yarn.com has a variety of yarns from a lot of different companies, and that's a good choice. You can certainly shop on Etsy, and that's where you're going to get some of these more indie dyed yarns, independent dyers, and more unique stuff. And then a lot of individual, micro businesses owned by one woman, two women, have their own setups and their own websites. And I couldn't possibly tell you about them all. I have already told you about one of my favorites, which is Fiber for the People. She did not give me any money to say this. A good place to start if you want to start looking at sort of these independent yarns is to go head over to Instagram and just search yarn, and there's just tons of it. Or follow some knitting pattern designers and see what yarns they're using. Yarn is really everywhere. It's not it's probably not at your Target. It's not at the grocery store here in the US, at least. I know in some countries that's different, but it really is everywhere. There is lots of it available, all kinds of price points, all kinds of qualities. Go out there and go ahead and get yourself some yarn.